Welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. With Henry Seltzer, we're going to take a look at this new moon that's coming up this weekend, coming up tomorrow morning early. And once again, we find a lot of outer planet connections in this new moon. So let's take a look at the chart right away. So here we have the chart in time passages. And, one thing we can notice about the chart is that the sun and moon are at 26 degrees of Scorpio. This is a Scorpio new moon. It's toward the end of Scorpio. And then very close, 26 to 25, we do have the connection with Uranus that we've been seeing ever since the August 21st new moon, which was the solar eclipse, which was called the American eclipse, which was seen all across this country. That was very much also coincident with the new moon, as all the new moons have been, August, September, October, and then November. And, we're seeing closer and closer connections, especially last month when there was a trine. This month it is an inconjunct or 150 degree aspect, but and this month it is a degree off actually. So this is a little bit less of a powerful presence of of Uranus than we've been seeing. On the other hand, we also have a strong presence though of Pluto. Why? Because what we see with Pluto is that Mars at 16 degrees of Libra is exactly square, coming into a perfect square in the next degree or so, which is the next couple of days. So over the next day of this, this weekend, over Saturday and Sunday, Mars is going to be exactly square to Pluto, and that's something to think about. There tends to be reactivity when Mars-Pluto is invoked. It's very appropriate for Scorpio, Mars being the co-ruler of Scorpio, along with Pluto. And what it's really good for is going to the depths. So, the caution is that there may be reactivity, there may be buried anger that comes up. You can feel that anger coming up, and when you do, it's a really good idea to, if you can, to pause and take stock, because, as a friend of mine says, you're never angry for the reason you think you are. In other words, what's triggering you is maybe something that goes back to core issues, goes back to issues from early childhood perhaps, from early school experiences perhaps. Those traumas lodge within us, and if we don't pay attention to them, they can take over and give us trouble. And if we do manage to pay attention to them in the moment, it can save a lot of grief, a lot of trouble, a lot of things you wish you hadn't said. So the recipe is to pause. The recipe is to take a look at how that anger is mounting, study it in a dispassionate way, from almost the witness viewpoint, and say, gee, there's anger coming up. I wonder what that's about. And instead of lashing out at the person who you're faced with, who's possibly what triggered the anger, you take a break. You say, I need to take a break. I need to think about this. Give me a second here. If you can, leave the room briefly, And then they say that you can actually explore your anger in your own way without damaging anybody by saying, God damn it, or whatever you might say. And then on the other hand, it's very good if you can just come back to that compassionate adult that you really are at the same time. Basically, if you can manage it, it's quite an acrobatic trick. But if you can manage it in the moment, to pause, realize that it's your anger, realize that it's you that's the whole situation, and have some compassion for that angry part of yourself, and kind of relate to that person in a way that's more balanced, and then relate to everybody around you in a way that's more balanced. That's the best. That's when we don't get reactive, we don't cause problems that have repercussions later on in the family situation or whatever situation we're in at the time. So that's a little disquisition there on the Mars-Pluto, which we do see quite strong in this configuration, in this new moon configuration coming up on Saturday. So it's something to think about. And even, we might want to add, on the West Coast, which is where the rising sign is for this chart, it's done for San Francisco, Mars is exactly rising. Within a few minutes of a degree. So as the new moon takes place, so it makes for a strong Mars. That's also good for getting things done. It's good for assessing where your activity is going and what you might want to do about that, in terms of, is this where you want to be putting your actions, or is it where you might be doing it habitually or because of a job you don't really like, and where can you make adjustments to the way that you actualize, the way that you get yourself out there in the world. So these are very interesting things. Now, the other thing I want to mention in connection with a strong Pluto, strong Uranus in this chart is that we also have a strong presence of Neptune coming up. Neptune has been prominent in all the full moons recently, and in fact, in this full moon that's coming up, and I'll show you the chart in a minute, there's an even stronger aspect for Neptune. And right now in this chart, we do have Venus making a trine. So Venus is at 13 degrees of Scorpio, still within a couple of degrees of the Neptune placement. So it's going to be in our emotional awareness. It's going to be a way that is part of our aesthetic right now, is that we have a kind of a longing for the source, a longing to go beyond the physical in the way we deal with everything. And this is coming in the context of Venus being in Scorpio, Venus being ruled by Mars and Pluto. So a depth-oriented Venus, they say natally with Venus in Scorpio, you can't have a superficial conversation. So here we have Venus in Scorpio that wants to go to depth. In the natural set of houses, it's in the Scorpio house, which is the 8th house of the natural chart, means going to depth. And then we have a strong Pluto in the mix as well. We have a sextile between Venus also and Pluto, about 4-degree difference there. So it's a rather intense configuration. And then the Neptune comes in. So there's a certain amount of wanting the ideal with Neptune. We see the way the relationship could be. We make the ideal be the ruler of the situation, and we sometimes can get disappointed when we don't come up, when the person that we're relating to doesn't come up to that ideal, and we may be disappointed or feel like we have to sacrifice ourselves, not what we wanted. So we have to learn to compromise. We have to learn to find the beauty in compromise, the beauty in the situation as it is. Loving what is a good mantra. So it's very intense new moon with a lot of both Mars and Venus involved, and all three outer planets involved, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Now you know Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto take us beyond the physical. They are what Dane Rudhyar called the ambassadors of the galaxy. We have our physical being and we go around in our normal ways in our day-to-day, but we still are always aware of something beyond the physical that is very much a part of our lives. And it was expressed in the recent times even, but even especially in the medieval times, as a longing for the other world, the spirit. You know, that we could do whatever we could do in this life, but it was really all about what happens after we die. We don't have to be that literal about it anymore. We can see it as a spiritual mandate that is part of our lives, even though we don't necessarily have a name for it. We may not have a particular religious affiliation that leads us to, or we might have, of course, that leads us to a way of characterizing this sense of the numinous and the beyond, but it's a very important factor in our lives. Neptune wakes us up to that which is beyond ourselves, and music and poetry brings us to that as well. Uranus is also considered the awakener, brings us to sometimes shocking situations, sometimes surprising, unexpected events that make us stop and think and bring us, outside the box, a way of thinking outside the normal run of things, visioning what could be possible, opening to possibility, freedom from the known, it's been called. And then Pluto is all about the transformation. Pluto is about the death and rebirth. It refers to death, but it's really the little death of rebirth that is enabling us to go beyond where we are right now, enabling us to make changes and leave parts of ourselves behind that we can no longer really support as the way that we want to be. Also notice in this particular new moon configuration, forgot to mention that Mercury is at 17 degrees of another sign of Sag. So Mercury is in a very close, within 4 minutes of a degree, a very close semi-sextile, which also contributes to the strong Neptune in this chart. Very strong. Now I want to take a look ahead just a little bit, because if we look at the chart for the beginning of December 3rd, which is when Mercury has just turned retrograde. Mercury retrogrades on the west coast around 11:30 p.m. on December 2nd. This is a December 3rd chart. What we have in December 3rd is the full moon is happening. So you can see that the sun is at 11 degrees now of Sag. It's moved into Sag. The moon is coming around to the opposition point, another 5 degrees to go. So it's before the actual timing of the full moon that day. But this is the station of Mercury retrograde. And what's so interesting about this configuration coming up in this next full moon is that while the sun and moon at the full moon a few hours later, about 10 hours later, are both going to be aspecting Neptune in a strong way, they're going to be making a T-square with Neptune. Simultaneously, this 29 degree mark is very significant where Mercury retrogrades because there's a quintile between Mercury and Neptune. You can see this if you think about 72 degrees. The quintile is a fifth of the circle. It's 72 degrees. I always add 12 and add 60 because that's a way that you can just see it visually. In other words, if we add 12 to this 29, we come up with 11 in the next sign, do we not? 11 in the next sign, and then take 2 more signs, boom, boom, we have Neptune. And it shows in the time passages software pretty well. Both, by the way, Saturn is also, I'll put the mouse there, is also conjunct this stationing Mercury. So we have a really strong Mercury retrograde coming up in early December. This is another little hint about what's coming down in these intense days. And at the full moon, also with Saturn conjunct the retrograde Mercury, also with Mercury making an aspect, a strong, close, very close aspect to Neptune. See how close it is. If I put the mouse on this line and I can see the Mercury part of it. Whoops, it's getting away from me. Well, maybe I should use the aspect grid. It's a little easier to see everything there. So I just go to the aspect grid, time passages. And here we have Mercury. And what aspect is it making to Neptune? Well, here's the quintile. We put the mouse. It's 0.2 of a degree, so it's much less than half a degree separating Mercury from this exact quintile aspect to Neptune. So I hope this is interesting material, and I hope you can see that there's ways you can explore these diagrams in time passages to your advantage. I think it's obviously, I'll put a personal chart up so you can see what you can do with a personal chart. Now I also wanted to show you Joseph Campbell's chart today for a couple of reasons. One is, I think everybody knows who Joseph Campbell is. I mean, he certainly became very, very famous when Bill Moyers did the series, The Power of Myth. He was known as a mythologist. He forged his own ground and became a brilliant speaker about mythologies, world mythologies. He wrote The Hero of a Thousand Faces, which reflected on how many of the mythologies of the world had very common themes about the hero who has to leave home, has to face trials and many trials and magical situations that get him out of the difficulties until he can get to the goal, which is sometimes referred to as getting the princess, but it's also, which is a common theme in our movies today, but it's also finding the magic elixir to bring back to society the things that the society needs to move forward. There's always a hero in the background somewhere that made these things happen. There's many, many, many examples in his book, and he was, that kind of catapulted him into greater prominence when that book became published. It's gone through so many editions and translated other languages, and it's just his iconic work. Now, what I'd like to show you in this chart is the very close connection between Mercury and Jupiter, both at 6 degrees of Aries. Also the Sun at 5 degrees of Aries, triple conjunction between Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter. And these things are all in a certain chime. Like, for example, the Moon is also in fire, only like 3 degrees off, 2 degrees off from the Sun, 3 degrees off from these other 2 planets. You have several other really close connections in this chart. And one way to show them is to, I'd like to explore a little bit some of these outer planets that are coming along. So we have Eris coming along, we have Makemake and Haumea were declared as dwarf planets at the same time as Eris practically. And so there's these 3 new planets out in the Kuiper Belt, and I've done a lot of research and I'm convinced that they're powerful in charts. And I've talked a lot about Eris. I think you've probably heard me say how important Eris is in charts. And in fact, if we look at the transits, in time passage, it's very easy to look at saved transits. You save them from time before. And we just go here. And then we want previous. I was looking at a different transit, actually. Well, I guess, okay, this is the transit chart for when he actually published The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And if I can actually go back a year, and this is 48. So in February 48, he was beginning to work on this book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And you can see that Eris, by that time, had reached 6 degrees of Aries. And that might ring a bell, 6 degrees of Aries, that's his Mercury degree. So his Mercury is 603. This is 603 actually by chance, because about a year before the publication, I know he was working on that whole time. For a couple of years actually, but Eris moves very slowly. So Eris was on his Mercury, writer, indicating a writer, the whole time that he was getting this iconic book out, which I think is fascinating. And then the other thing that I think is quite fascinating is that you can look at these new planets. If I say display TNOs, in chart points I go to display Eris and TNOs. And that will be these new ones. So here we have Haumea, and here we have Makemake. And Makemake at 23 degrees of Taurus is very closely connected with Eris at 23 degrees of Pisces. Haumea, you can see, is in very close conjunction with Neptune. So these are very significant. When you look at all these connections in his chart and realize who he was and what an impact he made, a lot of times with famous people you'll see these close aspects between their planets. And sure enough, this Neptune, Haumea, is square to his Sun, Mercury, Jupiter triple conjunction. It also makes a very close aspect, as it turns out, to Saturn, a sesqui quadrate. So, you see these things, and it really is a fascinating thing. And what would we say about Neptune? And what would we say about Haumea? Well, I found that Haumea and Makemake both have to do with a profound connection with nature. They are the first planets to be named after indigenous gods and goddesses, not from the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses that have been used for all the other planets up until now, including Eris, which is from the Greek mythology. So we have a profound connection with nature in connection with this idea of Neptune, this idea of going beyond. The mythologies of the world are all about going beyond. So a close connection between Neptune and Saturn in his chart, that sesqui that's existing there. And also between Saturn and Pluto, incidentally, you can see the trine. It also trines his ascendant. So there's a grand trine counting his ascendant with Pluto and Saturn. But the Neptune-Saturn is what interests me, because it is about bringing into concrete realization the mythologies that inform us about what's going on outside of ourselves in these numinous regions. And to have it with Haumea connects it up with nature. Now you might say, what's the connection between mythology and nature? And I wondered about that too when I first saw this in Joseph Campbell's chart. What was his connection with nature? And it turns out he was very connected with nature. When he was a young boy, he rooted for the Indians in the Wild West shows that were current in the early 1900s. He thought that was much more interesting, that they were one with nature and they were working with nature and natural things. He was quite an expert in plants and birds. When he was young, he explored all those things in the woods of Pennsylvania. And what he said about mythology is that mythology was really to revivify our connection with nature. That was the purpose of mythology. In all the societies of the world, all the way through history, to reaffirm that connection to natural process and natural law. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, when you see Neptune and Haumea, knowing that Haumea represents a profound connection with nature. And he also has strong Maki-Maki. To see it in the 9th house of philosophy and understanding, which that he was quintessential philosopher. So I think these things are interesting in that you can explore these things, like Neptune in the 9th house, we can click. And we cannot, this is a good description of what we have going on in the 9th with Neptune. We cannot yet click on Haumea because I haven't written it yet, but we can click on the position of Eris being right near the very beginning of his 6th house. And when you get a reading of that, service to others was his byword. That's what he really was all about, was making things better for the society that he was growing up in. So, of course, he has a very strong stellium in the 6th as well. I call Eris being in the 6th, even though it's within a couple of degrees, in the 5th within a couple of degrees of the cusp. This is an optional factor you can do in time passages, called a chart margin, house margin. And because we have 3-degree house margin, it's conjunct the cusp of the 6th degree of the 6th house within 3 degrees. And therefore, when we click on it, it tells us 6th house, the 6th house, and in Pisces. So these are some of the features that time passages has, which I think are very handy, easy to work with. We can go back and forth between charts very easily, as we've been doing, and we can advance or retard the transit charts too very easily, as I was doing with Joseph Campbell. We can look at current transits just by saying, let's see the transit by wheel for right now. And that's for November 17th, where we are right now. And then if we wanted to go back to that other transit, we can just go to Save Transits. And now we're back to February 13th, 1948, which is when he was working on his book. So I think that's all I wanted to bring forward. Do we have any questions that came up while we were doing this? Let's go back to the new moon chart. So this is the current information about what's happening right now. There's a lot of intensity and a lot of outer planet factors which it behooves us to pay attention to. And the more we can think about what's really going on with our lives, the more we can really understand that we're here for a deeper purpose, really, than just to go through life and then have kids and die. It goes, or not have kids and die. It goes much further than that, much more into what we're really about, which is beyond our physical selves. It's something that our higher selves tune into. And all these outer planet connections actually do reinforce that. I'm going to put away the Eris and TNOs. I leave Eris in the mix generally. And I guess that's it for now. So, good talking. And hope that was interesting to you. And see how it comes out in the next couple of weeks of this new moon that's coming this weekend. See you next time.